All right, so today we're going to be talking about Lambda functions as well as list comprehension. Has anybody heard of either of those terms before?
Lambda is kind of the equivalent to an anonymous function.
Exactly. So Lambda is the equivalent of an anonymous function in JavaScript, and we'll do a side-by-side kind of comparison. Anybody else?
We've talked about list comprehension in this course. It's kind of like a shortcut way of doing for loops, creating new lists from a list.
Okay. Yep. So did chat talk about that at some point on like a Saturday or at some point? Yep. Oh, yes. Go ahead. Cool.
Is this like kind of like the same as AWS? I know they have a thing called Lambda too.
No. So AWS Lambda, and anybody that's more educated in AWS than me, please feel free to correct me if I am wrong, because I'm not an AWS expert. But Lambda is essentially a service that allows you to just run processes, just some set of instructions in on their servers. So it's think of it as like a function that can just run anytime in any of your code, but it's specifically runs. It's like a specific function set of instructions that you write.
It's advertised as serverless functionality, and in theory, it's meant to run short pieces of code. So it's always going to be triggered by something. Like if you have a report that needs to be processed in a certain way, like that report will get sent out of something, and that'll trigger a Lambda to run, and that'll run a specific set of code. And the whole point of it is you don't have to deal with maintaining a server or anything. You just create a Lambda function and it does its thing, and you're not worried about any of the infrastructure.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Devin, like the interface is just like some VS Code, and you just write your function, you name that Lambda, and you can insert that Lambda in. You can either have it execute at a certain time or actually import it into some code.
You can have it set to a time. You can have it set to be triggered by something. You can set it to be triggered by something being passed to it. Like it could just be dormant until you pass it a JSON file, and that will automatically, it spins up the background resources. It does its Lambda function, and then it turns off. And the whole thing is like you're only charged while it's running, and a bunch of other stuff that is irrelevant.
Yep. Go ahead.
So like the equivalent in Azure would be like a trigger function.
Is that a question? I'm not.
Yes.
Quite sure. Oh
yes,
yeah.
Question mark.
I'm not that familiar with Microsoft Azure, so I actually don't know. All right. Yeah, good questions. Anybody else? All right. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and God dang it. So over here, I've got a JavaScript file, and on the left-hand side, I've got my Python file. And so in JavaScript, if we were to write an anonymous function, can anybody tell me how to write an anonymous function in JavaScript? There's a couple of ways. We'll actually start breaking it down from like old way to new way. Well, if we were
the arrow function.
Yep. We will get to an arrow function, but and you are exactly right. So an arrow function is where we're going to be going with the anonymous functions in JavaScript. But in like old ES5,
so you need to start with a variable, right? Like
yep. So like I'm going to do let's times 2. So we're going to take in a number and times it by 2 and return that new number. So if I do let times 2, I can write a variable, function. Just keyword function. It takes in some num, and it returns num times 2. And right here, this is an anonymous function because it doesn't actually, we're not defining a function. We're just defining an anonymous function and setting this this anonymous function to a variable called times 2. And in order to invoke that, we can just do console log times 2 and like pass in 4 because we're invoking this function or this anonymous function. So if I were to clear the terminal and run node anon, should be anonymous, we get 8. So that's how we'd write an anonymous function in JavaScript. Going forward, who said it? Was it Latasha about arrow functions? So,
Yes.
so the same thing times 2. If we were to convert this to an arrow function, we can say num and then return num times 2. And if we run that, I'm going to bring that down here, this console log, and run that again, we again get 8 or 5 or whatever we want. But with anonymous functions, specifically fat arrow functions, we can shorten this. So if, for example, we're not doing anything, we're just literally returning num times 2. We're not assigning new variables. We're not doing any no additional logic here. So it's just, we take in a number and we return something real quickly. So we can do the same thing and remove this. We can actually remove that, and we can make this a one-liner. And fat arrow functions, if we're only taking in one argument, we don't need the parentheses around the arguments, or I'm sorry, the parameters. And also, if we're just returning something super quickly, like return num times 2, we can get rid of that return statement as well as these curly braces. So we essentially turned this fat arrow function into a one-liner. Anonymous, or it's like it is a fat arrow function. So if we're to do the same thing and execute this code, I'm going to comment out that. So if I want to do times 2, pass in 7, run that, we get 14. So this fat arrow function is a one-liner. And where have you seen some of the syntax before in JavaScript?
Like a map function.
Exactly.
Or
Like
sort.
map function, sort function, filter, reduce. So those methods take in an anonymous function and do something with it, perform some logic typically. But generally they're one-liners most of the time. Actually nix that. They're not necessarily all one-liners, but they are all anonymous functions typically. So Python also has something equivalent to that, and that's called a Lambda function. But before we actually write a Lambda function, let's go ahead and do something similar to what we did on line 1 here in the JavaScript file, and define a function called times 2. And this times 2, the syntax, that's snake case. It's because I'm used to writing in Python right now. So this should be camel case. So disregard that syntax right there. So if I takes in some num and it just returns num times 2. And if I were to invoke that, print times 2, pass in 3, and I'm going to clear the terminal down here. Give us some more space. I'm going to do Python lambda.py, and there we get 6. And if we wanted to convert this, so something like what we did up here, to a one-liner kind of down here, but the equivalent in Python, we can first, so in order to make a function or a method in Python anonymous, we use the keyword called lambda. Oh. Lambda, like that, and see how it turns blue, which means it's a reserved keyword in Python. And I'm actually gonna bring over this fat arrow function just as a reference in Python or for JavaScript. So if I were to do the same thing here, but to convert it to Python. So after you declare that this is going to be an anonymous function, which is by this keyword lambda, I pass in any parameters that I need for this function. So for example, num, because it takes in a number as an argument. Next, in order to separate, just like right here, between the parameters and the actual logic or the instructions of the anonymous function, where here we have this fat arrow. In Python, we just have a colon, like so. And then we have whatever logic we want. So num times 2. So we have our parameters, a colon, followed by the logic. The only difference between like this fat arrow function is that we could turn it into a multi-liner like we do here, but with lambdas, they're always one-liners. So I can't do like substantially complicated methods using lambdas. So again, this is now an anonymous function, but just like these fat arrow functions or this fat arrow anonymous function, it has to be assigned to a variable. So I'm going to assign that to a variable times 2 equals this anonymous function, this lambda function that takes in a number and it just returns the number times 2. So again, takes in the number of parameters, at least one. It doesn't have to take in one, but it can take in none. And then just whatever the return value is. So if I had to run that times 2, invoking 6, now I get 12. What questions do you have about lambda functions? All right.
So say you had more than one parameter in the function. Say you wanted to take, like you wanted to add another number to the end
Okay.
or something like that. What would you do? How would you write that?
Yeah, good question. So lambdas with multiple parameters. So if we had a lambda function that we wanted to add 2 numbers together or multiply 2 numbers together, we can say like, I'm going to create a variable called multiply equals lambda. So we know this is an anonymous function, lambda. We know it's going to be a one-liner because lambdas functions are always one-liners. And we can say like num1 comma num2 colon num1 times num2. So with lambda functions with multiple parameters, you just separate each parameter by a comma.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. And if we were to run that, print multiply, say 3 times 5. I'm going to comment out line 6, that times 2 lambda, and we get 15. What other questions do you have?
So you said this isn't like used a lot.
I mean, it is used and you will see it in production Python code. But you'll rarely use it just day to day. It'll come in very specific use cases. For example, let's actually, new window. Where am I go? So if I did filter in JavaScript. So array.filter in JavaScript. Let's see. So the array filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. So I'm going to come down here. I'm back in the JavaScript file. And if I had like let array of nums equals, what is it? So if we had like a bunch of numbers, and let's look at this. So it returns a new array with elements that pass the test implemented. So I say I wanted to return an array of here and filter and just return a new array that returns just all the odd numbers. So I can say like let odd nums, odd number list equals, what was it? Array of nums dot filter. And let's look at this. So each word, how do I determine if in using a fat arrow function, something like this, how do I determine just return the odd numbers? Say like num.
If the
Go ahead.
modulet doesn't equal 0,
Like that.
thanks.
So it takes in,
Quick.
yeah, so it takes in each number. If this is going to be a Boolean value, this is going to return a Boolean value, true or false, of whether or not it passes this. So if num modulus 2 does not equal 0, that means it's an odd number. So equals 0, that means it's true. So if one modulus 2 does not equal 0, that's true. So it would be added to this list. So if I console log num list and run node anonymous. Oh no. I got 2 times 2. I got, should comment these out. Excuse me. So if I run that, it returns an array of all the odd numbers in this array. Again, if I wanted to see if all the even numbers, I can just use modulus. If the number divided modulus 2 equals 0, that means it's an even number. So I guess I would actually even, even clear. So I've got this first array, odd number list on line 17 is being printed off here. So this is all the odd numbers. On line 18, we use this filter, even number list. Okay, that's how you do it in JavaScript. Let's use a Lambda function to do the same kind of logic, but in Python. So let's use the same array of numbers variable. And in Python, we might have to do it a little bit differently, but I can say like odd nums equals, I want to create a new list and I'm going to use the filter method. And you can look at filter in Python. We got a bunch of them here, W3 schools. So here's one way to do it. So it takes in so the filter takes in a function, which is going to be an anonymous function or a Lambda function, as well as the array that we want to pass in. So if this first argument is a Lambda function, I can do Lambda, and it takes in the number. And if I wanted to essentially do the same thing here that I'm doing here on line 15 and 16, if I were to create an even number list, number colon num modulus 2 does not equal 0, and then comma or period, comma, and then I want to pass in the array of numbers that I want to test against. And I can print nums. If I clear that, run that, I get a list of odd numbers. Now, if I wanted to double each number in this list, instead of just using filter, what's the other method I can use instead of filter?
Is it map?
Yep. So I'm going to say double num list equals list. I'm going to map, and it's the same syntax, passes in some anonymous function as well as the array of nums. So lambda num times 2, because it's going to return num times 2, and array of nums. I'm going to comment out line 15 just so I don't have a lot of stuff showing up. I can print double num list. If I were to run that, now you can see this list is each element in this list is double what is in the array of nums list. All right. Any questions about lambdas? And you can get kind of wild with lambdas by like just doing a bunch of other stuff, but this is just kind of like the basics of it. But yeah, again, the main thing when writing just code is trying to make it as readable as possible for another developer to come in and know exactly what each line of code is doing. So when you see these awesome solutions that it's just like this one-liner function or one-liner piece of code that does a bunch of just chains on a bunch of methods together, it might work, but it's not necessarily the most readable. So just want to preface that. What questions do you have about anonymous functions?
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
So I noticed that we have to prepend list to the beginning of filter and map. And I understand that it does create the list from passing in those arguments. Just trying to understand why that's the case. Like how are we supposed I guess we just have to read documentation, but without reading documentation, how would we know that these functions have to have a list prepended?
Kind of just trial and error. Let's see what this looks like. I think this actually might still work. No, yeah. So this returns a map object, and then you have to create an actual list from that.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's like how would you know? So yeah, the map just returns a map object. So you'd have to convert that into a list.
Okay, thanks.
Honestly, it's not that intuitive. I just want to see if this works. Yeah, still doesn't work. Anybody else? All right. Let's go ahead. No, let's keep going. All right. This next let's talk about list comprehension. So I think earlier someone said it's like an easy way to create an array or dictionary or something. So yeah, so one of the interesting kind of like nice things about Python is the capability of doing list comprehension. It's like a quick way to generate a list or a dictionary. More often than not, it's a list. I don't think I've ever been in a scenario where I've needed to do it using a dictionary. But if you were to create, you're like, oh, correct, I need an array between 1 and 10. I'm sorry, 0 and 9, or an array that's 10 elements bit large. So previously, I'd be like, typically I'd write a method called def create list. And you can even pass in a number if you'd like. But here, I'm just going to create a list that is 0 through 9 because I want it to be 10 elements long or have a length of 10. So I'm going to say like sum list equals an empty list. And I'm going to say for I in range 10, sum list append I, and then return sum list. You should have seen this, like understand what this code is doing. So you've got an empty list. We're just looping through I, which starts at 0, and goes up to 10, excluding 10. So it actually goes up to 9. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it appends each index, or starting from 0 to 9, to the sum list, and it just returns this sum list. So if I were to print create list and invoke it and run this Python comprehension, we get a list from 0 to 9. But with list comprehension, we can do this all, like list comprehension isn't intuitive. It does take some practice to do, especially if you want to get a little more complex with regards to like logic inside of your list comprehension, because the placement of your conditions or an expression isn't always intuitive. But essentially, if I wanted to create a list, like some, I'll just say like list underscore 1 equals, using list comprehension, I create just a list. And then within the brackets, I'm sorry, within the, brackets or curly brace, not curly braces, square brackets, I write my actual, like my list comprehension logic. So in here, it should go my expression. So what do I want to return for X in range 10? Actually, I'm going to do I instead of X. So here it says for I in range 10, return I. And if I were to run this, print list 1, I get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's saying like return I for whatever item in whatever range, array, or anything. Questions on this? So it goes expression for item in iterable iterable item. So all this code, this create list, can be boiled down to this one piece of code. And say I only wanted, all even numbers between 1 and 100. I can say start at 0 and iterate by 2 and go up to 100. And again, whoop, why didn't it do that? Oh, sorry. 0. There we go. And we get all even numbers between 0 and 100. Let's go back. It's just 1 through 9. All right. What questions do you have about that? All right, let's keep adding on to this and add some logic in here. So remember Lambda function with this map, like I double each item. I'm going to bring this over here. And remember what this double list does. If I clear the terminal, run that, it doubles each item in the list. So map, passing this lambda, multiplies each item in this list by 2 and returns a list called double num list. If I were to use this, do the same thing, but with list comprehension, I can say double num list equals, I've got a list, and I could say return num times 2 for number in array of nums. And if I were to run that, let's go ahead and print double num list again. I get the same thing. So again, this is an expression, some piece of code. It doesn't, so for each number in the array of numbers, multiply each number by 2 and put it in the same index.
So quick question, for that to work, all of them have to be numbers, right? Like, so if there was any strings in there, it would be an error.
Yeah, so if I had like, I guess, yeah, no, I wouldn't throw an arrow, just do hello, hello.
No, that's cool.
Yeah. But yeah, just, if you are doing it, just make sure to alleviate any errors. Make sure that all the data types within the array or string are the same, or dictionary or whatever. So we did that, the same thing for map. Let's do the same thing for, what was it? Filter. So for filter, I'll comment that out. But for like odd numbers, Let's see what odd numbers does. So you take this filter, pass in this lambda function for each number within the array of numbers. If the number divided by 2 or modulus 2 does not equal 0, that means it's a negative number, or I'm sorry, a odd number, it's going to create a list. So if I do that, print odd numbers, we get all the odd numbers within this array of numbers list. We can do the same thing using list comprehension. So odd nums equals array. So this is where we actually have some like conditional logic, some if statements, because it's saying like, hey, if the number modulus 2 does not equal 0, add it to the list. So if it has one if statement, we can say, hey, return the number for num in array of nums if num modulus 2 does not equal 0. So conditional if statement. So again, return the number for number in the array of numbers if this num modulus 2 does not equal 0. If I were to do that, print odd nums, I get the same thing, all the odd numbers. I can also do even numbers like so, but we're doing odd numbers. Single if statement. But what if we wanted to do an if else statement? So like if it's even, return something. If it's odd, return something else. So an if else statement. So let's see. What can I do? I just want to kind of keep everything like the same, just use the same array of numbers. Let's see. How about if it's even, I want to make everything. I just want an array of true or false, whether or not a number is even or odd. So whatever index it is, I just want to return like 1 is odd. So I want it to say odd. 53 is odd. I want that index to say odd. 6 is even. I want that index to say even. So for this one, because here it's only a single if statement. If this is true, then it just returns it. So the original array is a little bit smaller than, I'm sorry, the new array is a little bit smaller than the input array. But here I'm going to say like odd, even, index equals. So if it's true, so if it's even, I want it to say even. So that's what I'm going to return if this number is even. If the number modulus 2 equals 0, else odd for num in array of nums. So if I were to run that, odd, even, index. So odd, odd, even, odd, even, odd. So you can see what index has an odd or even number. I could also just say, do some logic like, hey, instead of just doing even, I'm going to multiply the even numbers. I'm going to make all. So how about this? I'll make all the odd numbers even by adding one. Or I don't know, just trying to think of something, because you can also do logic on here. So num times 2 if the number is even, else I can return the number minus 5 if the number is odd. So for example, since 1 was an odd number, I subtracted 5. 53 was an odd number, so I subtracted 5. 6 was an even number, so I times it by 2, etc. So you can perform some logic on each element in the array. And you don't want to get too crazy with these logics with the list comprehension, because again, you want it to be readable for other developers. What questions do you have about list comprehension? And this is about as complex as you probably want to get with it. I mean, you could get more complex, but nothing.
So if the conditional requires an else, you actually have to move the conditional in front of the iteration syntax.
Like this part,
Yeah.
like, yeah, move that in front of the iteration. Whereas if it's a single if statement, it goes at the end.
So you couldn't put like else at the end of that statement on line 24.
Here,
Yeah.
else none. Well, I guess for this one, let's actually run it. I don't think so. So yeah, see how it's throwing an error.
Okay.
So you'd have to move that right there.
Cool.
So what's the benefit of using list comprehension over just doing some logic? Because you can easily write a method that does the same thing. So like iterate for num in array of numbers if, so you can actually do this in a multi-line function like so.
Code's more compact and it's not that difficult to read. It's actually a little bit easier, I think, sometimes.
If you understand like the list comprehension, like the syntax of what's going on, yeah, I agree. It's almost easy, not easier to read, but it's like, okay, I see what's going on here. But there's another benefit, and is that list comprehension compiles in so like this code compiles in Python and then compiles down. List comprehension compiles directly into like C code. It like directly is converted into C code and compiles from there. So it's quicker from like a computational standpoint. But in the grand scheme of things of what we're doing, it's minimal, but just know that's one of the benefits is that it compiles down directly to, I believe, C. All right. Any other questions on list comprehension? Does take some practice to get used to, but you could do if statements, else statements, or just run logic on each element in the list.